Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Read and Reread. I am Angelia, and today I'm very excited to bring to you my favorite fiction of 2024. I'm going to do a separate list of my favorite nonfiction, but these are my top fiction books of 2024, and I struggled. I overthink this every year. I fiddle around. It's 10, it's 15, it's 12. I have runners up. I don't have them. I just go around and around and books move and in and out. And then I decide I just have to film it. Here it is today. This is my top whatevers. I don't even know. I think I have a top 12 and some honorable mentions. And I'm not doing a ranking. I'm not counting down, although there is kind of a top 6. I'm first going to do a little lightning round of the honorable mentions. First one, it was a library book, and it was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Somehow this book is tight and off the rails at the same time. It's bonkers. It's kind of a haunted house story, but is the house haunted, or is it just the people? Is somebody manifesting stuff? It's psychological? There's every single character is perplexing and strange, and the plot too, and I want to read it again. I love Shirley Jackson. The next one is Eastbound by Maylis de Kerangal, translated from the French by Jessica Moore. I am currently reading her new book, Canoes, which is a collection of short stories and a novella. So last book I'm reading of 2024 with my friend Michael, but we both loved Eastbound. It's a novella. It takes place in Russia. Two people have a chance encounter on a train, and a young man who wants to go AWOL from the Russian army, and a French woman who has her own thing she's trying to escape. Sorry for the camera jiggling. I have an assistant. We are cat sitting this week while my daughter is on a trip, and Moo decided to come help. The next one is also a slim little volume. It's We the Animals by Justin Torres. This was his first book. It's a novel, but it's pretty autobiographical. If you start to read interviews and hear more about Torres's life and backstory. But it's lyrical, it's poetic, I had to stop and reread so many passages. It's very intense and visceral about these 3 little boys growing up in a tumultuous household. The next one is Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig. It was written in the 1970s, but it seems timeless. It seems very contemporary. It's intimate. There's 2 men in a prison cell in Buenos Aires, and I read it in the aftermath of another book that is up in the top 6. We'll get to that later. But the style and the format was an influence on this other book. It's excellent. I've thought about it for years, finally read it, loved it. The next honorable mention is Dearborn by Ghassan Zeineddine. I'm not sure. I don't want to mispronounce, but I'm not sure. This might be suffering from lack of recency syndrome. If I had just read it, it might have ended up in the top 12, but it was way back earlier in the year. It's a fantastic debut collection of short stories by an Arab American writer, centering around people in Dearborn, Michigan, in the Arab American community. Each story, they're not really linked stories, but there are a few overlaps or people mentioned in other stories because they're all from the same community. But the character building in each story is fantastic. Each story I got completely engaged and involved and wanted to know what was going to happen to these people. I will be reading this again. And the last honorable mention is The Blackwater Lightship by Colm Toibin. I read this, I think this was the first book I read in the year. So again, it might be suffering from, your movie's supposed to come out by Christmas for Oscar consideration, and this was in January. But this is a book, I think it's from the 90s. Yeah, 1999. But this was, and I meant to put it in my Quiet Gems video, and I accidentally left it out. But it is a beautiful book about 3 generations of women who gather at a seaside home to take care of brother of the youngest woman. There's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. And then there's a brother. He is dying of AIDS, and he hasn't even told all of the family that he's gay. But now he's dying, and they gather together along with a couple of his friends. It is a family saga. The family's been estranged. Different people are in contact with each other but not contacting others. There's a lot of reasons for that. Almost the whole book is just different scenarios of different combinations of these people coming together. And every time they do, it reveals a different facet of each person. Just when you think you know who's in the right, who's in the wrong, who's the annoying one, who's the sensible one, it shifts and you see people in different lights. And it's really beautiful. It's very sad. And so now we have to get on to the main event, in which I will try to slow down just a little bit, but not too much, so this video isn't hours and hours long. I have a top 12. So here we go. The first one is Tell Me Everything by Elizabeth Strout. I know that some people were mildly disappointed by this book or didn't feel it was the best one in the overall saga of Olive and of Lucy Barton. And I will say it's probably not my favorite out of those series, but I found it immensely satisfying, and I really loved all the time I spent in this book this year. You do definitely, I don't think this would work very well as a standalone. I reread all of the Lucy Barton books and the 2 Olive books preceding the reading of this year, and I really benefited from reviewing all that I had learned before, because all those people and a lot of those events are referred back to in this novel. But we do find Lucy living now in Maine, in the same town where Olive Kitteridge is a resident of a nursing home. She still has her faculties intact, but she's getting on up there. I think she's about 90 years old in this book. And the conversations between Lucy and Olive are wonderful. It's also mostly about Bob Burgess, a previous character from other books, and Bob's friendship with Lucy and his complicated feelings about her and his wife and a brother that he has had long-time issues with. And so it kind of helps if you like Bob too, but I enjoyed this very much. The next one is The Blue Book of Nebo by Manon Steffan Ross, originally written in Welsh and then translated by the author into English. It is a post-apocalyptic novel. I've talked about this many times this year, most recently in my Quiet Gems video. But on the Welsh countryside live a mother and her teenage son, and they have been surviving for, I don't know, like a decade since some sort of well, they don't know what really happened. Some sort of an unspecified accident or attack has occurred. They've survived radiation sickness. They live on the land. Right when everything was falling apart, the mother, Rowena, collected a bunch of books in the library, thinking ahead about gardening and food cultivation. So she is a very resourceful person, but she's also a very private person. And her son is now in his teens, and he really wants to know more about life and life before and her and everything. And she just doesn't divulge a lot of facts. And there's also a baby sister mysteriously in the family, since there are no other people. And so the 2 of them find a journal in an abandoned house, and they begin to write in it in separate portions, promising not to read each other's portions. And the book is the journal, and it is so good. I keep talking about it, and it's just leading me back to needing to read it again. The next one was one of the big good surprises of the year, and that was that I finally read Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. I have a checkered past about Lincoln in the Bardo and George Saunders in general. His short fiction, I have loved some pieces and not loved some other things. It's been a mixed bag. And back when Lincoln in the Bardo came out, I think I won the Booker. I meant to read it. I even had it. I picked it up a couple times, opened it up, saw the format, backed away, wasn't sure. I was afraid. I don't know what I thought. I didn't think it would be difficult to read. I think I thought it would be gimmicky, or I just wouldn't like it, or it would disappoint me. And so years went by. It was even a family joke between Stephen and I about Lincoln in the Bardo, the book that never got read. And then more recently, Stephen decided to read it. And right when he was starting it, I found a copy in the clearance bin at Half Price Books. So I checked it out, and he continued to read, and he was blown away. And so that inspired me to finally read it. And I was also then blown away by this beautiful tale told in many, 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 many voices. I did not find this hard to follow at all. Once I saw what the format was and the sequence and how to tell who was talking and shifting between the voices, that was not a problem at all. I recognized the different characters. It's sort of like, well, it reminds me of teaching, not really with the library, because then I saw every single kid in the whole building, but when I was a classroom teacher and I had a smaller group, and after a while I knew all the kids just from their voices and from their handwriting. So I don't know, that was how I felt reading this. I got to know all the separate characters, but to cut a long story short, the Bardo is like a limbo time between life and death. I think it's a Tibetan concept, and there is a cemetery, a mausoleum, where Willie Lincoln has been laid to rest after dying tragically. He's a child. It's the middle of the Civil War, and Lincoln is consumed with his grief, and he keeps coming to visit Willie at the crypt and talking to him and touching the body. It's disrupting all of the spirits in the cemetery, many of whom most do not understand that they are dead. That's all I'm going to tell you about it. It's very unusual. It infuses some historical details of the time with this plot. I mean, it's the voices of ghosts, and they're from all different time periods, because it's everyone who's come there through centuries. I'm kind of making a muddle of describing it, but it's really outstanding and really unusual. The next one, I'll put a picture up because it was a library book, and it's My Friends by Hisham Matar. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and I was really shocked and dismayed when it was not shortlisted for the Booker Prize, especially in light of some of the books that were on the shortlist and the winner. But we're not going to go back over that again. My Friends is really an excellent novel. It did win the Orwell Prize for political fiction, and that's a well-deserved and appropriate award for this novel. It's about a young man named Khalid this is in the 80s. He goes to college in Scotland. He's Libyan, and he and another friend at this university where they are closely monitored. The group of Libyan students are closely monitored, but he takes a little day trip with his friend to attend a demonstration in London at the embassy. And it was a demonstration against Gaddafi. And they go in disguise. They put on balaclavas, and something happens. And this is based on a real life event, an actual demonstration, the aftermath of this event. And so what started out as curiosity and a lark turns into a life-changing event. And it is about, Khalid is telling the story, and it's about himself and two friends, the one that he traveled there with, and another man who's a little bit older and is significant to him from an earlier point in his life, an author. It's about the experience of exile and friendship, and also there's a lot in here about reading and literature and language that also I found very interesting. And the entire book is told in the format of a long walk across London that Khalid is taking. He has left off a friend at the train station, and then he's walking back across the city to his apartment and reflecting back and telling us this entire story of everything that happened since the 80s. And when I first, I avoided this book a couple of times because it looked long, it was thick, the cover is not good, and I was afraid it was boring. I was afraid it was going to be heavy and ponderous, and it was not like that at all. The plot is at different times tense, at different times sad. It captures the sorrows of exile in a way that I've not read before, and I was really engaged. The next one was another wonderful surprise, and it is The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe how good this novel is. Just not as a crime novel, not as a 1950s novel, some kind of genre category, just a crackling, excellent novel, a psychological study. It also does capture some tensions of that time period as well. But I was led to read this after watching the recent Netflix adaptation that's just called Ripley, which is superb. I had loved the old movie, and then I loved this new adaptation. Stephen and I really liked it, and my friend Michael Clark was also watching it, and we decided to read Talented Mr. Ripley because neither of us had ever read it. And we're on kind of a little low-key mission to read more Patricia Highsmith. It was just astonishingly good. I think that it gets categorized as a crime novel, and maybe people are missing out that don't usually read that kind of fiction. And there is crime, but that's not the point. And it's definitely not a whodunit, because you know all the time exactly who did it. The interesting part is why. What's going to happen? It's about a man named Tom Ripley, a young man in New York City in the 1950s who is a not very good con artist. He's doing some mail fraud to get some money, and he stumbles into an opportunity when he is mistaken to be a better friend than he is to another young man named Dickie, who is living the best life in Italy. Dickie's father wants him to come home and take up his role in his shipbuilding company. I don't know why Dickie doesn't go back and go to this job, because all he's doing is lolling around, making bad paintings, going out in his boat, hanging out with his girlfriend who likes him a lot more than he's into her. And he's just the most dissipated, trust fund guy. And of course, he doesn't want to go back home to New York City. He's having a great time. So anyway, Dickie's dad hires Tom, thinking Tom is a close friend, to go and convince Dickie to come home. Well, Tom sees the opportunity to get a free trip to Italy and takes it. But Tom is complicated. Tom is psychologically fascinating, and he becomes very enamored of Dickie in his life. And a whole string of things happen that I'm not going to tell you, because that's the whole point of the story. But it's really interesting to read it in light of those adaptations too, because both of them are both faithful and unfaithful at different points in the plot. I think that the more current one is a little more faithful to the book, but it's interesting to see the differences, and I really loved the book and both adaptations. All right, the next one is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman and translated by Roz Schwarz. This book was first published in 1995, but I didn't hear about it until this past year. It started popping up everywhere on BookTube, and this is probably the weirdest book that I read this year. It is a slim post-apocalyptic novel about, I don't know what happened, nobody knows what happened, but there is a young narrator who's a young woman who lives in an underground bunker in this room with 40 women. She's the only one who was put there as a child. Everyone else was already an adult. And they're in this big caged room that is patrolled by some armed men who never talk to them outside of the enclosure. She has grown up here, and now she's a teenager. She's trying to make sense of the world that she lives in, how this happened, where they came from, and she starts shaking up the status quo, as a teenager will do. And so the world building is bizarre and absolutely gripping and puzzling. Some things you come to understand more, some things we never understand. But that is the initial premise, and then something big happens, and then we move into a different phase of the plot. But all along we have this narrator who has never known men. She has seen some men, she's never talked to them. She's living in a world of women and trying to both survive and decide what to do, what's meaningful in life, what kind of relationships are valuable. And it's like nothing else. It's so bizarre, and it could have failed miserably and just been the most corny, weird, like a corny old episode of a science fiction show, but it is not. It is absolutely fantastic. I would love to see a good adaptation of this story. We are now into the top 6. Okay, that's my big demarcation there. And these are my absolute tops, but I'm not ranking them in any particular order, except I kind of have a number 1, so I'll do that one last. Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hession, Irish author. I've talked about this book so many times, and I just loved this book. And how many times have I said that I'm getting ready to read his other 2 books? Have I done it? No, I have not. Ghost Mountain is just sitting there reproaching me with its ghostly mountainous self, but I will get to it soon. Leonard and Hungry Paul, beautiful story about a friendship between 2 men in their 30s who are kind, thoughtful, content. The changes in life are big to them, even though they're small in the overall scope of human experience, but they both are at kind of certain crossroads where they could decide to take some risks. And is it worth it to disrupt a pretty good thing in pursuit of something that might be better, but maybe not? So I'm being very vague, but it's funny, it's warm, it's not trite in any way. Somehow he deftly avoids all the traps that could have happened in a book like this, and it's just so satisfying. Next, probably the saddest book, and also one of the funniest books at the same time that I read this year, is All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Taves. When was this written? I don't know. 2014. And again, the minute I read it, I was like, wow, I've got to read everything by Miriam Taves. And I haven't read anything. I do have a copy of Women Talking, which everybody loves, and I haven't read it yet. 2025, I'm coming for you, Miriam. I've got to read that book at least, and maybe think about some other ones. But this was so good. It's so, so good. It is about a woman named Yoli who is trying to convince her beloved sister, Elf, to not take her own life. Elf is deeply depressed and has attempted suicide more than once, as did their father. It is quite autobiographical, I have learned, and somehow this very dark topic leads to many funny conversations, largely because Yoli is just such a funny person. She is a woman in the midst of her second divorce. She has 2 teenage kids. She thinks that she's a big mess, but she's actually just the most together person. It really is an example of doing the best you can imperfectly and just nailing it. She's a really roll with it mom for the teenagers. She loves her sister deeply. At times she's so angry with her, but she just loves her so fiercely. Everyday life keeps coming in waves, and then they're in the midst of this crisis. Jolie's really one of the best characters I've read in years. Another character that I really love through 2 novels is Eilish from Colm Toibin's novels. This is Long Island, which is a sequel to Brooklyn. Do not read Long Island without reading Brooklyn, because you're just not going to get the full benefit of the story. Brooklyn is the story of Eilish coming to the United States as a young woman in around 1950. We pick up in the 1970s with Long Island. 20 years later, she's married. She has some teenage children. She finds out some startling and unhappy news at the beginning of the story, which motivates her to make a trip back to Ireland for the first time in all these years to visit her elderly mother. And she does reconnect with some other people that she knew in town and explores the decisions that she has made and whether or not she wants to pursue any new paths. It is a really quiet story. Eilish is sometimes frustrating, sometimes puzzling character. She, just when you think you have a good handle on understanding her, she does or says something that just sends you down a different direction. But I'm really drawn to her, and there's other characters in this book as well. Her mother, wow, what a weird and fascinating woman. Through both of the novels, really, kind of a interesting, manipulative person that really deserves a novel of her own. I'd love to see a novel about her in her younger years from her point of view. Colm Toibin is excellent at creating characters, dialogue, quiet stories. So this is one of my authors that has popped up twice in my list this year, and I am looking forward to reading. I do have over on my shelf his book that he wrote about Henry James, which I want to get to this year. It appears that we're moving into the top 3. So let's see what I still have up my sleeve. We have Blackouts by Justin Torres. I haven't seen this on anybody's top 10 list, but I love this book so much. And I know this one is kind of a not for everybody, but it really was for me. And this was also a very successful buddy read. Michael and I read this earlier this year, not knowing exactly what to expect, but having heard good things. And then when I went to the book festival in San Antonio back in the spring, I saw Justin Torres speak, and that really made me want to read the books. I really liked him. his personality, the things that he said about his background research for the topics in this book were really interesting. And this led me on all these reading rabbit holes. That's why I read We the Animals, why I read Kiss of the Spider Woman, Pedro Paramo, and I don't know, I feel like there was maybe something else. It's really hard to describe what this book is about. There's a young man and an older man. They're both gay, but they're not lovers. They met years ago when the young man was a teenager and they were both institutionalized in the same facility. The older man's kind of a mentor-like character. Now he's dying and the young man has gone to visit him at a strange, surreal place out in the desert called the Palace. The two of them spend many nights having these long conversations in the dark about lots of things from their life. Well, things from the younger man's personal life. The older man's a little cagey about his personal life, but he wants to pass on his body of work that he's been doing about an actual book that did exist called Sex Variants, A Study of Homosexual Patterns. There was this woman in the early 20th century named Jan Gay who collected all of this information and documents and interviews and all kinds of body of work about queer lives of all kinds. And she could not get it published. She finally passed her body of work to a committee with I think there was a psychologist at the helm of it, who she thought it was going to be kind of given some scientific heft and published. Instead, they co-opted it and turned it into this book about deviancy. And instead of publishing her work as she intended as being a panorama of the diversity of queer life, it was published as a psychological document about deviant people. And so the older man, Juan Gay, has been trying to revive and bring to light the real story, but now he is dying and he's passing off this work to the younger man. The younger man has had his own very difficult life that we get in bits and pieces as they talk in the dark. So that's kind of what it's about. But there's so much, there's redacted texts, photographs, documents interspersed from the actual real book that existed into this fictional narrative. It's experimental, it's emotional, it's intimate, it's unusual. It was influenced by Kiss of the Spider Woman and Pedro Paramo, and had to read all those other things that kind of went into the background of Justin Torres writing Blackouts. I loved everything about this. I liked the story, I liked the characters, I liked the formatting and the pieces of ephemera and redacted texts. I liked even the way it looks. It's got this brown print. I mean, everything about this book. I had some really good success this year with some unconventional formats in novels that I really loved. And this one, I think, was the one I loved the most of all. Okay, we have two more books. We have a short story collection and a novel. My top novel of the year is going to be the least surprising thing in the whole pile. But the runner-up is History of Sound, a collection of stories by Ben Shattuck. Again, not enough people have found this book. It is so incredibly excellent. Ben Shattuck has created a collection of stories. They have a pattern. It's called Hook and Chain. This is from inside the book. A song or poem popularized in 18th century New England in which the first and last lines rhyme and contain rhyming couplets within. So the whole book is A, B, B, C, C, D, D, and then you get to the end, you have A again. Those are how the stories link. And it begins, this is being adapted into a movie, and who was in it? I think it's Paul Mescal and Jacob Elordi. Am I lying? Jacob Elordi. Am I lying? I'll double check. But it is being, so if that'll motivate you to hurry up and read A History of Sound, whatever gets you going, you need to read it. It takes place in New England. A lot of it's in Maine. The beginning of the structure is about two young men who are traveling across the countryside trying to capture the musical traditions that are dying out, and it's right before World War I, and they're using the newfangled recording equipment that I guess is records, and they're just meeting all of these people in the countryside and talking to them, recording their sounds while they are having a love affair. And then the first story is about one of the men, years later as an elderly man, coming into possession of some of those original sound recordings. And then we go off onto different people, different time periods, kind of the same geographic area, but a whole big range of different stories. I guess there's a similar mood to Northwoods. It's more realistic than that, and it doesn't stay in just the one house. We have a wide range of people. The connections between the different pairs of stories are really satisfying. Sometimes the two stories are completely different time. It's not like a sequel to the other one. It could be a completely different time period. Somebody finds an artifact that was significant in the first story, or backwards. It might start with the more contemporary story and then we go into the past. We eventually get to the story where somebody finds those wax cylinder recordings that link back to the beginning story. But I'm wondering how they're going to film this, because that connects, but the interior are all these different stories. So I'm not sure what they're going to do with that. But anyway, the stories are beautiful. I do love a good short story. And this is my favorite short story collection of the year. And then finally, big lack of surprise, my number one novel of the year is James by Percival Everett. I don't know what more I can say about this that hasn't already been said. If you're one of those people who kind of shies away from the hyped books, I hope you will eventually come back around and give James a shot. And I know there's this ongoing debate about whether or not you have to read Huckleberry Finn. I guess you don't, as long as you understand what Huckleberry Finn was about and its significance in American cultural history. But I did benefit from rereading Huckleberry Finn shortly before reading James. That's all I can say about that. You don't have to, but I've read Huckleberry Finn many times. It's sort of ingrained in me, and I still really benefited from a refresher before reading James. Absolutely indelible character creation. It's more like a conversation with Huckleberry Finn or a companion piece than it's not really a rewriting. It is a re-examining of that time period, of people in that time, the story itself, and James' experience. There's so many times in Huckleberry Finn where James and Huck are separated, but we keep going with Huck. Well, what was James doing all that time? Here's the answer. It is at times laugh out loud funny, at other times wrenchingly, devastatingly tragic. It's not for the faint of heart or light material, even though some of it is quite funny. And it is quintessential Percival Everett at the height of his powers, and also in the best control of his powers. He can get a little off the hook sometimes. Sometimes some of his books have some real zany spin-outs, and I feel like he really, really controlled it so well in this book. And I'm a big Percival Everett fan. So James, it lived up to all the hypes for me, and I am so glad to have read it. All right, that's it. That's my top whatever I said. And let me know if you've read these books, what you thought about them, or what your top books were. You will probably mention something that I'll need to add to my list. If you totally despised some of these books, I want to hear about that too, because I love to hear those differences of opinion. It's so interesting. So that's it. Let me know. I'm going to do a separate one for nonfiction, and I also have a book haul coming up in the near future, but probably the next video. It'll be one of those, and then we'll go on to Friday reads. I forgot what day of the week it is. Okay, have a good week. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.